The cold wind of dusk swept across the forgotten cemetery on the edge of the small town, stirring dry dust that clung to the scent of freshly turned earth. The widow, dressed head to toe in black, knelt before a mound of soil, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers tight against her chest. Her face was pale, etched with the sorrow of someone who had cried far beyond what the body could endure. Her fingers trembled as she leaned forward, laying the flowers gently upon the nameless grave. No one knew who rested there, but to her, the act carried a weight that felt heavier than simple pity. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rustle of petals in the wind and the creak of old wooden crosses. As she brushed her hand across the cold earth, a strange shiver crawled up her spine. It wasn't just the loneliness of grief. Something about that grave felt different, as if it resisted being forgotten. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath, telling herself it was only her imagination. Yet her heartbeat betrayed her, quickening with the uneasy rhythm of secrets buried too deep. Behind her, just a few steps away, a figure emerged through the haze. A man in a broad hat and a long dark coat stood motionless among the gravestones, silent as a shadow. His stance was rigid, authoritative, though not without a quiet tension in his frame. The whisper of his coat in the wind sounded almost like a warning. The widow didn't turn, but she felt him there, heavy, inevitable. The man said nothing. He only watched, a solemn figure burdened not only with the weight of the law but with something more hidden. The town's sheriff was rarely seen at funerals, and never at the grave of someone without a name. And yet, there he stood, his eyes fixed on a woman grieving for a stranger. What had brought him here? This wasn't the first time their paths had crossed, but never under circumstances as strange as these. The widow lowered her head again, whispering a prayer that barely reached her own lips. Her voice shook as though she were pleading not only for the soul beneath the dirt but also for her own restless spirit. She wanted to believe her life still had meaning, that her small acts of kindness mattered in a world that often swallowed both the living and the dead without distinction. And then, as the clouds broke just enough to let a thin ray of light strike the grave, she realized the sheriff was no longer simply observing. His presence carried intent, heavy as iron. In that moment, she knew this act, leaving flowers on a stranger's grave, had tied her fate to something larger than grief. Something was about to begin. The morning sun had risen high over the prairie, turning the fields into waves of gold that shimmered beneath the heat. The widow, known in town as Clara Whitlock, moved through the wooden fence line of her small ranch, her hands rough from work but steady as ever. She wasn't thinking of graves or shadows then. Instead, her thoughts were on the squeak of the gate hinge, the creak of leather straps, the smell of horse sweat and hay. Life in the West had a rhythm, harsh, repetitive, yet strangely comforting. To Clara, tending the land was both a burden and a lifeline. She brushed dust from her skirt as she walked back toward the porch, where a chipped tin cup of water sat waiting. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, to where the sky stretched endless and pale, offering no promises. That morning, a rider had passed down the road, leaving behind nothing but hoofprints and a trail of questions. He hadn't slowed, hadn't looked her way, but Clara had felt a prickle in the air as if his presence meant something more than a man on horseback. She told herself not to dwell on it, though unease clung to her like a shadow. In town, the atmosphere was equally restless. Shopkeepers lingered at their doors longer than usual, eyes-tracking strangers who drifted through with guarded expressions. Rumors moved quicker than wagons, whispers of railroads buying up land, of outlaws testing the patience of lawmen, of something stirring just beyond the borders of safety. Clara had overheard two men talking at the general store the day before. Their words were clipped, anxious, as if they feared the wrong ears might be listening. She carried those words home, tucked behind her silence. That afternoon, as she repaired a section of fence near the southern pasture, a child appeared at the edge of her property. A girl no older than 10, hair tangled, clothes worn thin, clutching a small satchel like it was her last possession. Clara froze, startled by the sight. The girl didn't speak, only stood there with wide, watchful eyes. Something about her presence unsettled Clara more than any passing writer or rumor ever could. The child looked like she had run from something or someone. Clara knelt slowly, trying not to frighten her, and asked where she came from. The girl's lips parted, but no sound followed. Instead, she extended the satchel toward Clara, her hands trembling. Clara hesitated before taking it. The weight inside wasn't much, but whatever it was made her chest tighten with unease. She opened it just enough to glimpse folded papers, worn and smudged with dirt. Her first thought was of deeds or contracts, the kind men would kill over. As the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the fields, Clara felt her world shift in subtle but undeniable ways. That night, long before she found herself kneeling in the graveyard, she stood on her porch with the satchel in hand, staring out at the endless plains. Something was off. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first crack in the fragile calm. By dawn, Clara had not slept. The satchel rested on the table beside her oil lamp, its papers untouched since the moment she brought it inside. She kept staring at it, as if the leather straps binding it were snakes coiled tight, ready to strike. Her instincts told her to burn it, to rid herself of whatever burden the child had placed in her hands. Yet another part of her, the part that still carried a widow's heart heavy with loss, whispered that perhaps the girl's silence had been a cry for help. Clara felt torn between the safety of indifference and the risk of compassion. When she rode into town later that morning, the satchel remained hidden under her cloak. She intended to keep her mouth shut, but already the weight of its secret seemed to bend her spine. At the blacksmith's, old Marshal Keating greeted her with a nod. His gray mustache twitched as he asked if she had heard the latest talk about strangers buying up land deeds under false names. Clara forced a tight smile, shaking her head, though her heart thudded against her ribs. It was as if the man could see straight through her. Later, at the mercantile, she overheard neighbors debating. Some urged caution, a widow ought not to meddle in trouble that ain't hers. Others spoke of duty, of standing up when the law looked the other way. The voices overlapped, growing tense, and Clara felt the heat of their words burn against her skin. In the end, she realized no advice would lift the weight. The choice rested squarely on her shoulders. That afternoon, she rode past the church and paused at the edge of town, staring back at its steeple. She thought of her late husband, a man of stubborn honor, and wondered what he would have done. He would have opened the satchel, faced whatever storm lay inside, even if it meant his own ruin. The memory cut deep, reminding her of the price he had paid for his convictions. Still, Clara's hand moved almost on its own, loosening the leather ties until the flap fell open. Inside were deeds, contracts, and a name written over and over, a name she recognized but wished she didn't. Her breath caught. If the papers were true, then powerful men were playing a dangerous game, and the girl had dragged Clara straight into the middle of it. She quickly closed the satchel, scanning the horizon as if someone might already be watching. The weight of her decision pressed down harder than ever: walk away and live quietly, or stand firm and risk everything. As the sun dipped low, Clara knew the time for hesitation was over. Her choice, though she had not spoken it aloud, had already been made. She would not abandon the girl, nor the truth hidden in those papers. But with that vow came the first ripple of danger, the kind that promised trouble would soon find her door. By the next morning, Clara could feel the air shift. The prairie, usually so open and steady, carried a strange tension. When she stepped onto her porch, she noticed faint tracks in the dirt near her fence line, hoofprints that hadn't been there the night before. They circled her property once before fading toward the creek. Whoever had ridden by hadn't come to visit. They had come to watch. In town, the atmosphere was no less unsettling. Men gathered in tight clusters outside the saloon, lowering their voices when she passed. A ranch hand tipped his hat politely, but his eyes lingered too long on the satchel she carried beneath her shawl. Even the shopkeepers, usually quick to call out a friendly greeting, seemed hesitant, their smiles tight, their glances darting toward the street. It was as if the whole town sensed something brewing, something they were too afraid to name. That afternoon, Clara tried to keep herself busy mending a broken hinge on the barn door, but her mind drifted back to the child. The girl had vanished just as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving behind only silence and that cursed satchel. Clara searched the edge of her land for footprints or signs of where she had gone, but the trail was faint, almost swallowed by the dust. Each unanswered question only deepened her unease. As the hours passed, more signs of trouble crept in. A rider on the ridge, too far to identify, yet close enough to stir her suspicion. Smoke on the horizon, thin and deliberate, rising where no homestead stood. At dusk, she swore she heard the echo of hoofbeats across the valley, though the fields lay empty when she scanned the distance. These were not coincidences. They were warnings, quiet signals meant to rattle her resolve. That evening, Clara brought the satchel inside and placed it on the table once more. She stared at the documents until her vision blurred, her mind replaying the names she had read. Each one carried weight, men with power and influence, men who would not take kindly to their dealings being exposed. If word spread that she had those papers, she would be branded a thief or worse. And yet, the thought of turning them over to the sheriff filled her with doubt. Trust was a fragile thing in a town where the law was often for sale. As night fell, the sound came, faint at first, then louder. The steady rhythm of hooves striking dirt, growing closer, circling her land once more. Clara stood by the window, lantern dimmed, hand pressed against the satchel. Her breath caught as shadows flickered past the barn. Trouble was no longer a whisper on the horizon. It had arrived at her doorstep. The knock on Clara's door came hard and sudden, rattling the hinges as if the visitor already owned the right to enter. She froze, one hand hovering near the satchel on the table, the other gripping the edge of her chair. The sound of boots shifting on her porch confirmed it wasn't a neighbor come calling. Whoever stood outside carried confidence or arrogance enough to demand her attention. When she finally opened the door, two men loomed in the fading light, their dust-stained coats hanging heavy, their eyes scanning her home as though they'd already decided she was guilty of something. "Evenin', ma'am," the taller one said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard you been keepin' company with a stray girl wanderin' these parts. Thought maybe you'd like to clear a few things up." His voice was smooth, but his gaze was sharp, measuring every flicker of her expression. The second man remained silent, his hand resting casually near the butt of his revolver. It wasn't a conversation, it was an interrogation wrapped in politeness. Clara steadied her breath, forcing herself to meet their eyes. "A child came by, yes. Lost and frightened. She didn't stay." The words came out calm, though her heart pounded hard enough to bruise her ribs. She noticed the way the silent man's gaze drifted toward the table inside, where the satchel lay half covered by a folded blanket. A spark of panic shot through her, but she didn't move. Movement would mean guilt. Stillness was her only shield. The taller man chuckled, though it carried no humor. "Funny thing about children," he said, stepping across her threshold uninvited. "They pick things up. Things that don't belong to them. Sometimes they pass them along to folks who don't realize the danger." His boots scraped against her floor as he moved closer, eyes sweeping over the room. Clara's knuckles whitened around the chair she gripped. She knew then these men weren't asking, they were warning. A sharp noise cut through the tension, a shout from outside, followed by the clang of metal against the fence. The men stiffened, exchanging quick glances. For an instant, Clara caught a glimpse of uncertainty in their posture. She seized the chance, shoving the door closed and sliding the bolt home. The thud of fists followed instantly, curses barked into the night. But by the time she snatched up the satchel and bolted through the back door, the riders outside were already mounting their horses, circling her land like wolves scenting blood. Clara sprinted across the field, the satchel pressed tight against her chest, the sound of hooves thundering behind her. Every breath was fire in her lungs, every step heavier than the last. She didn't know where safety lay, only that turning back meant surrender. And as she ran into the darkness, one truth settled in her bones: this was no misunderstanding. This was a hunt. Clara didn't stop running until the lights of town flickered ahead, faint and distant through the night air. Her lungs burned, her skirts tangled around her legs, and yet she pushed forward, the satchel pressed tight against her chest. When at last she stumbled into the alley behind the general store, she leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. The riders had not followed her this far, not yet. But she knew it was only a matter of time. With trembling fingers, she loosened the leather straps of the satchel once more. The truth inside had nearly cost her life. It was time to see exactly why. The papers spilled onto the ground, fluttering in the cool wind. Deeds. Contracts. Letters marked with seals from powerful men whose names carried weight in every saloon and courthouse west of the Mississippi. Clara's eyes froze on one signature in particular, Sheriff Dalton Reeves. The very man sworn to uphold law and order was tied to the scheme.
Land seizures, false claims, and intimidation.
The writers hadn't been strangers at all. They were his men. The girl had delivered not just secrets but evidence of corruption so deep it could poison the whole town.
Her stomach turned as the weight of realization sank in. Reeves had been elected by neighbors she once trusted, a figure of supposed justice.
But the papers painted him as a man selling out his own people for profit, aligning himself with railroad tycoons eager to carve up the land.
Clara thought back to the grave where she had laid flowers, an unmarked mound, forgotten by most.
Perhaps the man buried there had known too much.
Perhaps that's why he'd been silenced.
And now she had been chosen, unwillingly, to carry the burden forward. A noise jolted her from her thoughts, the scrape of boots against cobblestones. She stuffed the papers back into the satchel, heart-hammering, and pressed herself deeper into the shadows. A figure appeared at the far end of the alley, moving with care, not like a drunkard stumbling home but with the measured pace of someone on patrol. For a moment, she feared it was one of Reeves's men. But then the lantern light revealed another face, Deputy Harris, a young lawman with eyes too honest for the work he had chosen. Harris stopped short when he saw her. His gaze fell to the satchel, then flicked nervously back toward the street. "You shouldn't be out here, Mrs. Whitlock," he whispered.
"They're looking for you."
His voice carried urgency but not malice. Clara studied him, torn between trust and suspicion.
If Reeves commanded the law, then even Harris could be a pawn.
And yet, something in his unease told her he hadn't chosen this path willingly. Before she could answer, Harris leaned closer, lowering his voice to a ragged whisper.
"Whatever you're holding, it's bigger than you know.
One wrong move, and this whole town goes up in flames." His eyes darted toward the saloon, where laughter rang out over the sound of a piano.
"But if you want the truth, you can't keep running. You'll have to decide who to show it to and who to keep it from."
His warning hung heavy in the night air, and Clara knew her next choice could set fire to everything she had left. Clara barely slept, her mind tangled in knots of fear and resolve.
By morning, the entire town seemed sharper, colder, as if every face carried suspicion.
She kept the satchel close beneath her cloak as she walked down Main Street, every set of eyes following her steps. Children paused in their play, merchants leaned out of their doorways, and men at the saloon porch hushed their conversations as she passed.
The papers inside the satchel were no longer just ink on parchment.
They were dynamite, and she was carrying the fuse. At the sheriff's office, she stopped short, staring at the wooden door with its flaking paint and crooked sign. Sheriff Reeves's name was carved into the brass plate, a symbol that once promised safety but now filled her with dread. She imagined walking in, slamming the satchel onto his desk, and demanding justice. But justice under his roof was a wolf's mouth disguised as a sheep's. The moment Reeves knew she held proof of his betrayal, she would be finished. Her life, her land, everything she had fought to hold on to would be swallowed whole. By midday, the pressure tightened. 2 of Reeves's men appeared near her ranch, circling like vultures. She watched from the distance, hidden in the tall grass, as they rode slow around her property, eyes lingering on the windows and doors.
They weren't searching.
They were sending a message: she was no longer safe in her own home. Clara's chest clenched with rage, but also fear. It was one thing to fight for herself. It was another to risk losing everything her late husband had built with his hands.
That night, she met Deputy Harris in secret, behind the abandoned feed mill at the edge of town.
He looked pale, younger than usual, his hands twisting nervously around his hat. "They'll catch you if you stay here," he whispered.
"Reeves already suspects.
He told his men if you don't hand it over soon, they're to make sure you disappear." Clara's blood chilled, but she did not flinch. Harris leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "You have one chance. Tomorrow, the council meets. If you show them the papers before Reeves can bury the truth, you might turn the tide. But if you fail, he'll kill you where you stand." For the first time, Clara felt truly cornered. To wait was to invite death. To act was to stand against the most powerful man in the county. Her mind raced through every possibility, every escape, and yet each path seemed to lead back to the same grim truth: there was no turning away now.
Reeves's corruption had reached too far, swallowed too much. If she stayed silent, she was complicit. If she spoke, she was a target. The moon hung high above as she returned home, her hands shaking as she placed the satchel on the table. She lit a single candle, staring at the flickering flame until her vision blurred. The choice had been made for her. Tomorrow, she would walk into the lion's den with the truth clutched in her hands. It was reckless. It was desperate. And yet, it was the only way left. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt a spark of defiance burn inside her chest. If Reeves wanted war, she was ready to give him one. The council chamber was packed tighter than Clara had ever seen. Men in wool coats and women with handkerchiefs pressed to their lips filled the benches, whispering as the air buzzed with anticipation. The wooden rafters groaned under the weight of silence, broken only by the scrape of chairs as councilmen shuffled papers and adjusted their spectacles. Clara stood near the back, the satchel heavy in her grip. Every eye turned when the doors slammed open, and Sheriff Dalton Reeves strode in with his men, hat tilted low, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitlock," Reeves drawled, his voice smooth as polished steel. "Heard you've been spreadin' tales around town. Dangerous habit for a woman alone." He stepped forward, boots echoing like gunshots on the floor. The councilman stiffened, clearly uneasy, but none dared speak. Clara felt her throat tighten, fear clawing at her resolve. Yet she reached into the satchel, pulling out the folded papers. The room leaned forward as if the entire town had been holding its breath. "These aren't tales," Clara said, her voice trembling at first, then hardening. "They're proof. Deeds stolen, contracts forged, and signatures that tie you, Sheriff Reeves, to every crime." She laid the documents on the council table, her hands steady now. Gasps rippled through the room. Reeves's men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between their leader and the crowd. For the first time, cracks appeared in his mask. Reeves laughed, though it was thin, brittle. "Forged papers. Lies from a desperate widow who can't mind her own business." He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms. "You all know me. You've trusted me with your lives, your families. Who are you gonna believe? A woman kneeling at graves, talkin' to shadows?" His words struck hard, and Clara's chest ached at the thought of being cast aside, alone against his power. But then a voice rose from the benches. "Not lies," Deputy Harris said, stepping forward, his face pale but resolute. He held up another sheet, one Clara had never seen before. This came from Reeves's office. His handwriting. His seal. He sold the land to the rail company before half the owners even knew. The chamber erupted, shouts, cries, disbelief. Harris's hands shook, but his voice cut through the noise. "I won't stand by anymore." The twist struck like thunder. Someone from Reeves's own ranks had broken silence. Reeves's face darkened, the smile gone, his hand twitching near his revolver. The crowd surged to its feet, councilmen shouting over one another. For one breathless moment, the room seemed ready to ignite into chaos. And then, all eyes turned back to Reeves, waiting for his next move. The future of the town balanced on a single heartbeat, and Clara realized hope had found her, but only if the council had the courage to listen. The council chamber quaked with voices, some shouting for Reeves's arrest, others calling for calm. The sheriff's hand hovered over his revolver, but Clara could see it now, the doubt in his eyes, the flicker of fear he tried to bury beneath arrogance. The townsfolk pressed forward, no longer content to sit in silence. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. Reeves was powerful, but even he couldn't outgun a whole community ready to rise against him. Councilman Abernathy, an older man with silver hair, banged the gavel until the wood cracked. "Order," he roared, his voice carrying above the din. He lifted the papers Clara had laid before them, and then the one Harris had brought. "These signatures match. The evidence is clear. Sheriff Reeves has betrayed the very people he swore to protect." His words silenced the chamber, cutting through the noise like a blade. Reeves stiffened, his jaw clenching, but the weight of truth had already tilted against him. For the first time, Reeves's men hesitated. One of them lowered his hand from his holster, glancing nervously at the crowd that now seemed more like a jury than mere onlookers.
Another took a slow step back, unwilling to stand too close to a man whose power was slipping fast. Betrayal rippled in reverse. The sheriff, who had built his empire on loyalty bought and bullied, was suddenly standing alone. Clara's chest swelled with relief, though she kept her stance firm, knowing the fight wasn't over until Reeves was disarmed. The sheriff snarled, his voice dripping venom. "You think a mob decides justice? You think scraps of paper mean more than a badge?" His words rang out, but they no longer carried command, only desperation. Harris stepped forward, steel in his eyes, and drew his revolver. He didn't aim it at Reeves, but held it low, steady, a symbol that the law no longer belonged to one corrupt man. Murmurs swept the room. For the first time, Clara saw a spark of courage ignite in the crowd. A farmer in the front row, one of those who had nearly lost his land, spoke up. "We decide justice when the law turns its back." Others nodded, voices rising in agreement. Reeves's shoulders sagged, the bravado draining from him as the tide shifted fully against his favor. With a final, guttural curse, he slammed his hat to the floor, his authority collapsing as quickly as the silence that followed. 2 council guards stepped forward and placed him in irons, the clink of chains echoing like a verdict. As Reeves was led away, the chamber erupted again, but this time in a different tone, not chaos, but relief, mingled with anger and resolve. Clara exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks, her body trembling with release. Around her, the townsfolk's voices grew louder, promising change, demanding accountability. The truth had survived the night. The fight had cost her nearly everything, but for the first time, Clara sensed a fragile hope taking root. The West was merciless, but tonight, justice had carved out a victory. Weeks passed before the dust fully settled over Greystone. The council moved quickly to appoint a new sheriff, and though debates raged over who should hold the badge, one truth was clear: Dalton Reeves would never again rule through fear. His trial was set, his land seized, and his name spoken only in whispers of caution. The people of the town walked a little taller now, though the scars of betrayal lingered in their eyes. Clara watched all this unfold from the quiet of her porch, the satchel no longer a burden but a reminder of what had been risked and what had been saved. Every morning, she still visited the unmarked grave. The wildflowers she placed there seemed to last longer now, as if nourished by something more than soil. Some townsfolk began to join her, leaving their own tokens: a carved cross, a folded letter, a tin star once pinned to a deputy's chest. The grave was no longer forgotten. It had become a symbol, not of death, but of truth unburied. Clara often wondered if the man resting there had known how much his silence would one day speak. The child who had started it all returned once, shy and hesitant, her satchel long gone but her eyes still carrying secrets. Clara welcomed her with open arms, offering bread and warmth. No words were needed, the girl's presence was enough. Together they stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the horizon burn with sunset. Clara realized then that fate had chosen her not because she was strong, but because she had been willing to act when others looked away. That was the quiet kind of courage her husband once carried, and now, somehow, she did too. Deputy Harris came often in the following months, his visits first marked by nervous courtesy, then by a steady trust. He spoke little of the night in the council chamber, though his eyes carried the weight of it always. With him, Clara found conversation that soothed rather than stirred, a companionship that grew slowly, like roots winding deep beneath the earth. He never asked for thanks, nor did he seek recognition. Perhaps that was why Clara began to believe he was the right man to wear the badge when the council finally chose. 1 year later, the town gathered in the square. The air was filled with music, the sound of fiddles and laughter, and the smell of roasting meat. At the center, Deputy Harris, now Sheriff Harris, stood tall, his badge gleaming new, but his eyes carrying the humility of a man who knew how fragile justice could be. Clara watched from the crowd, her hands folded around a ribbon-wrapped bouquet. When Harris spoke her name, not in accusation but in honor, the people applauded. Her courage had not been forgotten. That evening, as the stars bloomed across the sky, Clara placed her final bouquet of the season on the grave. The wind carried her words into the silence. Sometimes, in the West, the fastest draw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first. She lingered a moment, then turned toward town, the glow of lanterns guiding her home. For the first time in years, the widow felt at peace. The West remained harsh, but within its dust and shadows, something new had been born: respect, hard earned and enduring.